Be it resolved, the truckers were right to protest the excessive mandates and lockdowns and the increasingly woke authoritarian tendencies of the Liberal government, its bought and paid for mainstream media, and mainstream educational systems that have been captured by woke ideologies for decades already. You might want to research the phrase long march through the institutions for reference on that. The invocation of the Emergencies Act was not only unjustified but dangerous and damaging to social cohesion in Canada. Trudeau's extraordinarily rude attitude towards the truckers was intended to provoke a violent response. That's an admittedly long-winded resolution, and this is probably about a lot more than that. Perhaps you will see why the following quotes are significant. In my studies of communist societies, I came to the conclusion that the purpose of communist propaganda was not to persuade or convince, not to inform, but to humiliate. And therefore, the less it corresponded to reality, the better. When people are forced to remain silent when they're being told obvious lies, or even worse, when they're forced to repeat lies themselves, or repeat things that they don't want to, land acknowledgements would be an example. You never hear any discussion about whether or not people are doing that voluntarily, and if they didn't want to do it, they wouldn't say that they didn't want to do it. I'm sorry, when people are forced to remain silent when they're being told the most obvious lies, or even worse, when they're forced to repeat lies themselves, they lose once and for all their sense of probity. To assent to obvious lies is, in some small way, to become evil oneself. One standing to resist anything is thus eroded and even destroyed. A variety of emasculated liars is easy to control. I think if you examine political correctness, it has the same effect and is intended to. That's from a man named Theodore Dalrymple. Theodore Dalrymple is Dalrymple. His interview with Jordan Peterson is fascinating. In that interview, you will find the argument that if only women could stop having children with bad boy types, and if only bad boy types could keep impregnating the kind of women who like bad boys, in or out of wedlock, prisons and psychiatric hospitals would be practically empty. His reason for believing that, he worked in a psychiatric prison and rarely, if ever, met an inmate who was not the product of that kind of mating. And I think that would be an interesting study. Go and look at what sort of families psychiatric patients and prisoners are coming from. In one part of the interview, he described a young man whom he had asked, who's your father? And the young man said, what do you mean, this week? Seriously, you're not going to see an improvement in any situation unless you start facing certain realities. Anyway, I included this quote from Theodore Dalrymple saying that in my studies of communist societies, I came to the conclusion that the purpose of communist propaganda was not to persuade or to convince, not to inform, but to humiliate. And therefore, the less it corresponded to reality, the better. I included that because I think it really gets to the core of what Liberal Party, mainstream media, education propaganda, and cancel culture actually does to people, and goes some way to explaining why many people, including so many in the freedom movement, are so angry. I mean, it's a growth industry. Ranting and raving about this kind of thing, expressing this kind of anger, Tucker Carlson, Jordan Peterson, Dave Rubin, I mean, it's everywhere. Whether you like those people or not is one thing. Whether or not they're expressing a great deal of anger felt by a great many people is beyond dispute. The convoy gave them a chance to buck that trend, to act like good, powerful people fighting for freedom from authoritarian rule for themselves, their children, and country. It is the first time Canadians have needed to do that, but unfortunately will not be the last. I mean, the trucker convoy, that protest, was against authoritarian nature of the Trudeau government, particularly as expressed through what they believe to be the excessive mandates and lockdowns. But Canadians have never had to rise up against what they perceive to be an authoritarian government before. That's a first. And we were famous around the world for it. Let's hope that we learned our lesson and avoid mistakes like the horn honking and border closures, which constitute the only significant blemishes on the movement. Other than that, the protests were a model of non-violent protest. Here's another quote that would definitely resonate with a lot of the truckers and their supporters. When an opponent says to me, I will not come over to your side, I reply calmly, your child belongs to us already. What are you? You will pass on. Your descendants, however, now stand in the new camp. In a short time, they will know nothing but this new community. And I think that that's going to resonate with a lot of people who are concerned about the gender confusion that is being created in our educational systems and in social media and mainstream media. This quote, when an opponent says to me, I will not come over to your side, I reply calmly, your child belongs to us already. What are you? What are you? What are you? Who are you to say that your child probably shouldn't be changing his gender in elementary school? Who are you? What gives you this right? You will pass on. Your descendants, however, now stand in the new camp. In a short time, they will know nothing but this new community. And that's comes to us from one Adolf Hitler. The news of the day is the McKinsey thing. Justin Trudeau gave $120 million in contracts to a company that was involved in some pretty shady stuff. For Canadians, I think the most significant would be that McKinsey was part of a massive effort to deliberately create as many heroin addicts as possible. That is literally what they were involved in the United States, and they paid a $600 million fine for it. Okay, put that together with what Trudeau did, and he let dangerous people out of prisons to roam the streets on slack bail conditions. Together they caused the perfect plague. The streets are dangerous, especially in big cities like Vancouver, where you can't go anywhere without encountering mentally ill drug addicts who live much of their lives roaming the streets. These people need care. They need care, and they need it to be provided to them on a mandatory basis. What I think, we have an emergency. We'll have to do something extraordinary, and that thing would be to put these people into mandatory care without charges. I know that's probably legally impossible, but I don't think anybody wants these people necessarily going around with criminal records for drug possession. For the other crimes, sure, but drug possession, I don't think that people would be willing to go with that, and I don't think it would do any good. Mandatory treatment is what will fix this, and nothing else will fix it. And if we look at what our academics are doing with the situation, we can see that for the last 20 years, actually for 25 years, this has been getting worse. Okay, here's a little story that people might not know. About 25 years ago, I was watching, I believe it was the chief of police in Vancouver, and she was explaining to people that the reason that they were allowing so much heroin to be peddled in Vancouver, they were allowing it, was because what that would do is it would bring out the big-time drug dealers, and then they could catch them. So Canadians were being sacrificed. You had people out walking around selling little $10 things of heroin and creating as many addicts as possible, and the purpose was to catch the kingpins. Okay, the problem with that is that what they just did is that what the Vancouver police did is they increased the number of addicts, increased the demand, and if they catch one guy that's providing it, somebody else will step up. Seriously, that happened. The result, you see outright wretchedness. The things I've seen, I wouldn't want to say. I wouldn't want to say a couple of the things that I've seen. suffering on a monumental scale. The provincial leaders help people stay addicted all their lives with lack drug regulations. So you've got drug dealers. Some of them are pharmaceutical companies, like I think it was Purdue that McKinsey was involved in. They help to create as many addicts as possible. The federal government helps to create this disaster by letting people out on lax bail conditions. And provincial leaders help people stay addicted all their lives with lax drug regulations. Possessions of 2.5 grams of fentanyl is now completely legal in British Columbia. 8 years of incompetency, arrogance, and appalling waste, not just on these issues. This episode of woke rule is the most depraved thing Canada has ever done. Absolutely shameful on a lot of levels, and I tend to get to all of them, which would be impossible. It would be impossible. I remember that in the early years of his rule, I started to try to make a list of all the things that he had done wrong. And I know people don't like this. They don't like the guy. But apparently someone had asked Ezra Levant to do that. This is what I heard. Someone asked Ezra Levant, keep track of all the things that he's done wrong. And Ezra Levant said it was literally impossible. So he knows a lot more about politics than I do, because honestly, I didn't start taking interest in politics until there was a certain moment when Justin Trudeau just scared the hell out of me. Just something that he said. I might as well tell you what it was. What he said, what he was talking about is that he saw himself primarily as a teacher. And I thought for a second, so he thinks that he's going to teach me something. And it scared the hell out of me. That's just what happened. From that, it was like a light bulb went on. I know it's nuts, but at the same time, what we've seen is that I was right to be afraid. Just full disclosure, that's how it happened. Yeah, but there's no way that you can get to all of the things that he did. And this was quite early on. So the coincidence was I was thinking about making a list. Someone had asked Ezra Levant to make a list with all his resources, and he said it would be impossible. And at this point, I find it hard still to believe that would be impossible. But boy, it would have been very difficult to do. If I should have stuck with it, should have at least made an effort. And I worked on it hard. But I can't locate where I stored that information, so I had to go through all of this again. Okay, so let's just start where we are here. After 8 years of rule, we are $1.4 trillion in debt, with interest rates rising rapidly, affecting not only government debt, but all debt, household debts, all of that, including mortgage debt that is through the roof already. Interest on the debt is approximately $25 billion per year and growing, which probably don't need to say it, but that's $25 billion that could be spent on something more productive like, let's say, medical care. Morneau argues that policymakers put scoring political points and public perception over sound fiscal policy with their COVID benefit packages. What he was doing was giving money to friends. An authoritarian needs to have friends. There's no such thing as an authoritarian government led by a small number of people or by one. You have to have friends. And to have friends, what you need to do is you need to give them money in politics or access to power or some other thing. But he just borrowed the money from the rest of it, gave it to his friends with the hopes that it would get him reelected. Okay, in another context, Morneau said that Trudeau's economic policies put more emphasis on wealth redistribution than wealth creation. The problem with that is that kind of socialist scheme is that you eventually run out of other people's money to spend. Right? If you're not trying to make your country more productive, and you're also engaged in a lot of wealth redistribution, Well, eventually there's not going to be enough wealth to pass around. And whether or not you like Bill Morneau or not, I think that he knows a thing or two about economics, and that's what he said. Trudeau's economic policies put more emphasis on wealth redistribution than wealth creation. A government like this can destroy a country in a very short time. And if you don't believe that, just ask a Venezuelan. Or another person, you could ask someone from South Africa. Just to give a little background on South Africa. The apartheid government there was willing to start making negotiations with the black community, but Nelson Mandela and Winnie Mandela, who used to torture black people, for example, by putting a tire around their head, filling the tire with gasoline and lighting it on fire. Right? But Winnie Mandela, just look it up. And what happened was that as soon as Nelson Mandela came into power, he started implementing these socialist policies, and the country went down the tubes quickly. So, ask a Venezuelan, ask someone from South Africa. Okay, if a country wants to maintain a social security net, it needs to be productive, not destructive. So how many Canadians right now are employed in the woke grievance industry in government, education, and federally regulated industries like banking and insurance? Human resources departments are filled with them. Trudeau borrowed more than all of the other prime ministers combined and dumped it into the economy, causing the inflation that necessitated the interest rates to rise in the first place. Businesses were using COVID benefits to pay dividends. Canadian billionaires saw a 50% increase in wealth during the pandemic. Property values mushroomed. Rent went through the roof. And this after doing his best to shut down the oil industry, which causes inflation across the economy. Whenever oil and gas is involved in the production, distribution, and use of any service or consumer product, in other words, almost everywhere, inflation is so baked in with high energy costs that some are suggesting that rising interest rates won't even do that much to slow inflation. Just think about that. Despite the business closures, unemployment that they're sure to cause. And now they're moving to limit the use of fertilizers, which will push food prices even higher. Climate change is real. Want to make people hostile to efforts to ameliorate it? Do things like this. We should be helping Europe and especially Ukraine through the winter and making a fortune doing it. And yes, some kind of crisis in the supply of oil and gas was predictable. I'm going to come around to this again, but what Canada should have done for the last 8 years was produce as much oil and gas as possible, sold it into the international market, and did as much as we could to make ourselves a model of green efficiency. We could have had mass transit systems. We could have had programs to help people insulate their houses. I'm sure there's a lot of things that they could think of to make ourselves less reliant on oil and gas, which we haven't done. The United States did more to reduce their emissions than Canada did. And that's after pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord talks. Anyway, we're likely headed into a recession, perhaps even a period of stagflation, which is rising prices combined with unemployment and underemployment. The streets are unsafe, and this twit is in power. It's just baffling. When you talk to people who hold this view of things, you'll quite often see them almost get dizzy, trying to comprehend the insanity of what's happening. Like, it's just something that I've observed. They become less articulate, and they literally appear dizzy with the insanity of the situation. I think I just had a little episode of that myself. When I wrote this, I must have. His critics are not just angry about the direction he and the woke movement that supports him are taking the country, they are afraid, and for good reason. It may be some time yet until immigrants to Canada see through the Liberal Party and quit voting for them, and he or the NDP can count on the votes from the swollen number of federal employees, particularly given the fact that Poilievre clearly states that he wants to reduce government waste. They're bringing in a record number and have been through the pandemic and intend to into the future, despite the crisis in the medical system and housing prices and all that. They're bringing in more immigrants per year than at any other time in Canadian history, and they would not do that if they weren't counting on them for votes. Let's put it that way. They're counting on immigrants for votes. My guess is that a lot of immigrants come to Canada and will eventually see through him, and this tactic won't work forever. But I think it could work in the next election. Combine that with the record number of government employees he's taken on, and the fact that Pierre Poilievre clearly states that he wants to reduce government waste, well, he just bought himself another bunch of voters, didn't he? Quebecers won't vote for anyone outside Quebec. Wokies won't vote for Poilievre, and neither will a majority of women. Citizen aside, remember that little strip tease he did for the ladies before the "my favorite country is China" remark? That was a good one. The economic situation, the crime, that he intentionally created, the sense that things are broken and people are broken, especially due to the harm reduction policies. It is a disaster in the making, it's a disaster already, especially in urban centers due to the inevitable increase in crime that follows. Crime rates have soared by 32% during his period in office so far, with a 92% increase in gang-related crime due to the Liberals' soft-on-crime policies. The majority of crimes are committed by a small number of particularly psychopathic individuals who are arrested, charged, and released with astonishing frequency, largely due to changes made by the Liberals regarding bail. In British Columbia, 40 people were arrested for a combined total. This is from Pierre Poilievre. I find this difficult to believe myself, but he's not a liar, and I imagine he's got access to the correct information. Here's what he said. Excuse me, I had to have a sip of coffee. In British Columbia, 40 people were arrested for a combined total of 6,000 times. That is once every 2 days. What I've written here is that is twice per day. You can do the math. I think it's once every 2 days. And that is only the number of crimes they were caught committing. 40 people were arrested for a combined total of 6,000 times. That was over a period of 2 years, but we get the idea. What's happening is that you've got a small number of criminals that are, very difficult to deal with. They're committing the majority of crimes. You don't even have to put that many people in prison to correct this situation, but they don't. But whatever the number actually is, that they've been arrested for, the total is probably 10 times that, because that's normally how it goes. Criminals get caught for 10%, 5% of the crimes they commit, especially in places, I would guess, where the Gladue principle is in effect. Miles Sanderson, one of the men who went on a stabbing spree in James Creek, had been arrested 125 times, twice for attempted murder and 18 times for assault, many of them against the mother of 4 of his children. In 2018, he stabbed 2 men with a fork because they refused to join him in a robbery he had planned. The elite Aboriginal things, of course, all rush to blame it on residential schools. Like they'll just do it with, such predictability. You're dealing with ideologues. I just about said idiots. When you can predict what they'll do. So this happens. Oh, of course, it's all the fault of residential schools. The increasing dangerousness on the street is part of the context in which the truckers decided to protest against Justin Trudeau, as is the fact that housing is so incredibly expensive. Many are forced to live on the street. That's the sad thing about it is I've talked to homeless people sometimes, and they're not all crazy, and they're not all drug addicts. A lot of them, just due to the circumstances, they can't afford a house. Most common demographic that I can see, white males by the look of it. Just look around. What is the most common demographic amongst the homeless and the drug addicted? It's white males and white females a lot as well. Hospitals struggle to function while qualified health professionals sit idle. This is especially true in British Columbia. This is not his direct responsibility, but there is no doubt that he set the tone for that sorry state of affairs. Then what does he do? He increases immigration rates the highest in Canadian history and during the pandemic. To top it off, he went on a wild hiring spree. The government service is brimming with new recruits and definitely hired under DIE principles of diversity, inclusivity, and equity, who can be counted on not to say anything politically incorrect for fear of loss of employment, which is in itself a form of tyranny. Cancel culture is real, and the internet is replete with examples of it. At this point, if someone hasn't familiarized themselves with the phenomenon of cancel culture, they don't believe it's real, well, they're irresponsible. These are the sort of things that people are angry about, and the Liberals seem oblivious to it. Hanging over the whole thing is the perverse spectacle of DIE policies that serve the purpose of discriminating against white men, especially if they're straight. Sorry, but that's actually how it works. Literally, this is what it means, and nothing much else. And this is not new. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms says this: every individual is equal before and under the law and has the right to equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination, which is how it should be, and in particular without discrimination based on race, national, ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, or mental or physical disability. However, the next passage says, Section 1 does not preclude any law, program, or activity that has as its object the amelioration of conditions of disadvantaged groups or groups including those that are disadvantaged because of race, national, or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, or mental or physical disability. Okay, that document is 40 years old now and was written at a time when discrimination against certain groups was a reality. Fast forward today with decades of affirmative action and DIE policies, and the discrimination against white males in particular is a real issue that affects that group's ability to compete fairly in the universities and the workplace. This section 2 that says the second part that says that Section 1 does not preclude any law, program, activity that it has as its object the amelioration of conditions of disadvantage. You can discriminate against white men if you want. That's in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It needs to be rewritten. It has outlived its usefulness and should be scrapped. It won't be scrapped, though, because there's too much power and influence to be gained from its continuation. There's too much greed involved, too much vanity and pride. Or will it be scrapped? What do you think? Have you ever... Nobody talks about it. Nobody talks about that. I find that astounding. The only person I've ever heard say that is me. That the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that passage should be deleted. I've never heard anybody say it. Here's another interesting quote. And this one is particularly germane to the circumstance we're facing right now. The surest way to work up a crusade in favor of some good cause is to promise people they will have a chance of maltreating someone. This is punchy. The surest way to work up a crusade in favor of some supposedly good cause is to promise people they have the chance of maltreating someone. To be able to destroy with good conscience, to be able to behave badly and call your bad behavior righteous indignation. This is the height of psychological luxury, the most delicious of moral treats. That's from one Aldous Huxley. The protests were and are angry that the government serves us a substandard product and demands payment for it. The difference between a price and a tax is that you have a choice about whether you want to pay a price. Taxes are mandatory. Under certain governments, taxation really is theft. Under this government and many more in provinces, and many more, and in many provinces, we have seen a rapid increase in delayed onset gender dysphoria. Basically, a social contagion which often leads to surgeries that involve the amputation of young women's breasts, infertility, and a host of other medical issues. So this one is really strange because in a sane world, feminists would be arguing about this. The thing about delayed onset gender dysphoria, first I should explain what it is. It's a situation where a person has shown basically no confusion about their gender until, adolescence. And then they start wondering, and it's almost completely girls. So they hit 12, 13, and then they start thinking that maybe they're a boy. Now, don't you think that we've screwed up a lot of young women's minds at the point where you've got kind of an epidemic of 12, 13, 14-year-old girls suddenly thinking that they're boys? It is a really vulnerable time in their lives, just as they're starting to develop physically and emotionally. They suddenly got this idea. And then they go on from that quite often to start dressing like boys and taping down their breasts, which has a horrible impact on their bodies, testosterone treatments. And then eventually, if they go all the way, what happens is that skin is cut off of their forearm and used to build a penis. So they take skin off the forearm and build these poor girls' penises. Can you imagine? Can you imagine that this has happened to you? And you look back and you realize, okay, no, I was just a confused kid. Maybe I had a bit of Asperger's or something like that. Maybe I wasn't popular. And I was in a situation where, well, if I, followed that route, at least I had an in-group, right, to hang out with. And people thought I was cool. And the teachers thought I was special and paid attention to me. They wake up, however many years later, and think, what in actual happened to me? What have these people done to me? And this is coming. Lawsuits are coming. And this this whole business of doing operations on people to change their sex, lawsuits are coming on that. It's even more ridiculous because if they've got this thing called gender affirming care, if a kid comes to a psychiatrist saying he's the other sex, the only thing that the psychiatrist can say is support that decision. That's not what psychiatrists do. Psychiatrists don't have people come to them and say, oh yeah, you're right about that. Yeah, you're right about the other thing. Let me give you some hormones. If that was how psychiatry worked, well, it just wouldn't work very well, would it? Because a psychologist's job is to tell people quite often what they don't want to hear. I mean, this is another one of those points where people start getting dizzy and confused and lose the ability to speak. They're so baffled by what's going on. So you have to wonder, is this what they demand our tax dollars for? To confuse young people about their gender. So I guess this would be mostly property tax people paying into the school system. And apparently it is under a feminist government. Why aren't feminists, if they're actually concerned about women, concerned about this? By the way, how did Trudeau's gender-balanced cabinet work out? Is homelessness up or down? Drug addiction up or down? Our finances? Are we united or more divided than ever? Can we supply ourselves with the energy we need, or do we depend on countries with weaker environmental standards than ourselves? How's it going at airports? Immigration? How's our debt? Security on our streets? Let's list a few more of their debacles. As mentioned before, awarded $120 million in consulting contracts, mostly sole source to McKinsey for help running the public service. McKinsey was fined $600 million for pushing Oxycontin in the United States. France is on them for interfering in their elections. There's something in South Africa. In the 1950s, they were working for Big Tobacco. Trudeau would have known all of this. And okay, and when I say Trudeau, I mean Trudeau, his cabinet, his members of parliament, and at least you would think some of his supporters. Quite often when I say Trudeau, I mean the whole bunch of them. I mean the whole woke enterprise sometimes. And sometimes I mean particularly him. But he could have stopped that, I would imagine, if he had wanted to. So he gave them $120 million. Let's see, I've got this written down somewhere. What did the public service do? So they're supposed to help out the public service, but people in the public service says that they provided a few, generic presentations on very vapid stuff. There were nice colors, and they promised to revolutionize everything. But in the end, we have no idea what they did. So not only was this company involved in all these scandals all around the world, but they were given $120 million for work in Canada that nobody can find what they did. And this guy, Dominic Barton, is being questioned in committee hearings. I got to put this out there. This Guy's Garage. There's a YouTube channel called This Guy's Garage, and he covers what happens in committee hearings. If you want to know what's happening in Canada, if you want to hear officials actually expected to answer questions, you should be watching the committee hearings. Because if you're not, I don't think you can have a sense of what's going on. Not really. And the fact that it's not reported on as often as it should be is very telling. Committee hearings. CPAC has them as well. Okay, McKinsey was tied up in the Oxycontin scandal in the United States and at one point helped the Saudis locate political dissidents. What do you think happened to those guys? Our badass defense minister, Harji Sejan, was involved in, or very highly suspected of turning, I guess it would have been on Al-Qaeda. Anyway, over for torture. I'm sorry about that. I'll get to it later. Under the Trudeau government, the RCMP contracted the Chinese firm Sinclair, who had been charged 20 times in the United States with espionage and stealing trade secrets, to provide technology related to Canadian security. Sinclair, RCMP, contracted them to provide us with technology related to Canadian security. Again, under the same government, universities in Canada cooperated with the CCP to research into military technologies. We've got members of the CPP, I would imagine it would be the People's Liberation Army, doing research in Canadian universities into military technologies. Makes you think of the time he trusted the People's Liberation Army with Canada's vaccine supply, which caused, 4, 5, 6 month delay in Canada's vaccine rollout. That's a big deal. Because it was early on that we needed the vaccines. We're 4, 5, 6 months late with it because of the decision to trust the People's Liberation Army. Right? I mean, the thing is, I remember one time hearing Jordan Peterson talk, and what he said is that the astounding thing is that he will do 2 or 3 things in a week. He had seen it in 1 week that in the past would have brought down a government. In 1 week. I don't think that's, he did that on a regular basis, but once a month, probably. But just listen to this. Okay, yeah, I'm thinking about the big things, SNC Lavalin, he decided, to fire the first Aboriginal justice minister because, she stood up for the rule of law. Fired her. That should have been the end of his career. That should have been it. Uh, so this might be a little bit more contentious, but this is what I think. They arrested Meng Wanzhou, the Huawei executive. Okay, I'm just telling you the truth. When I heard that, I thought, well, that was certainly stupid. I know about the rule of law. I'm just contradicting myself, but she is the daughter of Lin Zhangfei, the founder of Huawei. When asked about the arrest of his daughter, he said, I didn't think Canada was that stupid. That's what he said, right? That arrest was not within Trudeau's purview to effect, but that did not stop him in the SNC Lavalin affair, did it? Perhaps he could have made an exception. The RCMP carried water for him by turning over the names of freedom protesters so they could freeze bank accounts. Perhaps they could have helped out there. At the risk of being called racist, Theresa Tam, okay, how have I written this? At the risk of being called racist by Theresa Tam, we allowed flights from China to land at a time that China was not allowing domestic flights. A bit of a change of topic there. Perhaps this isn't particularly well written. I don't believe that the RCMP operates independently. I don't. I think that he could have done something to prevent that from happening, or the Justice Department, or whatever it was. Okay. At the risk of being called a racist by Theresa Tam, we allowed flights from China to land at a time that China was not allowing domestic flights. It's a lot like they were trying to spread it outside the country, wasn't it? Theresa Tam collects a check from the World Health Organization as well as Canada. Conflict of interest much? Likewise, Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland works for the WEF. It was at a Davos meeting that Dominic Barton and Trudeau met. How perfect is that? Chrystia Freeland collects a check from the WEF and from the Canadian Parliament. I wish I could do the penetrate the cabinets line with a better accent. I mean, that was terrible. But yeah, Klaus Schwab said that. We infiltrate the cabinets, and then listed off Justin Trudeau, Chrystia Freeland, and a few other people. The World Economic Forum has penetrated our cabinets. Who do you think that serves? The global elite that compromises the WEF, or you, a regular Canadian citizen? She used to be a major critic of the WEF until they started cutting her a check. Anyway, let's continue with his other scandals. Elbowgate, remember that one? You should review the footage on that one. Kokanee Grove, a learning opportunity for the whole country. Blackface, another learning opportunity. The embarrassing India trip where the whole subcontinent laughed at him for his dancing fool routine and scowled at him for bringing along a one-time Sikh separatist convicted of attempted murder of an Indian politician. C-11, the internet censorship bill, limiting freedom of speech is characteristic of all authoritarian governments. The Aga Khan thing. Sophie pestered him for an invite, as it turned out. All the excessive travel, exorbitant and blatant overspending on luxurious accommodation, meals, and wine. Mary Simon, the first Aboriginal government, spent $100,000 on in-flight catering on her trip to the Middle East. In 1 month, the Trudeau family spent $12,000 on groceries. And in related news, Nannygate, remember that one? 282 delegates flown to Paris climate change meetings in 2015, and probably every other one since. twice what the Americans spent and 3 times what the Brits sent. And they were all wondering, well, what is this? Why do you have 200 or 300 people going and staying in nice hotels? I think the first one was in Paris too, wasn't it? And so you have to wonder, how much CO2 did that generate, and how much did it change anything? The big bad United States did a lot more to reduce emissions than we did, and that was under Trump. Sorry. Just to be clear on Trump, I was absolutely horrified when I saw him gaining popularity. Prior to his election, I hated him. He turned my stomach. I thought he was the most ridiculous person in the history of the world. And I believe I'm correct in saying, if it wasn't for all the woke nonsense, you wouldn't have had such an extreme reaction. That's what you get. If you behave in an extreme way, you get an extreme reaction, which is what they want. Donald Trump was a gift to the wokies, because they could spend the next 4 or 5 years criticizing him, feeling good about themselves, and ignoring anything good that he did. Under his rule, and I never liked the guy. Like, get that straight. I did not like him. But then what happened was I started seeing the things that he did. He handled the situation with North Korea. Obama thought we were headed for a war. There was one time that he said to Trump, like, really, I hope you can handle this situation. And he did. Under his presidency, there was no war between Ukraine and Russia. Didn't happen because he didn't want a war. Joe Biden wanted a war because it would help oil companies and weapons manufacturers. He was nominated twice for a Nobel Peace Prize for the peace that he helped establish in the Middle East, the first guy to do it. And it's just, people don't notice that kind of thing. He had better control of the border between the United States and Mexico. And something else that's interesting is that in the last election, the only demographic where he lost votes was amongst white males. Black females, green, whatever. Everybody, there was at least some increase in the number of people who voted for him. The one group where it went down was white males. It's a fascinating fact, I think. Anyway, hypocrisy and virtue signaling abound with this flaky government. It infuriates people not feeding at the trough. If you're collecting the check from the federal government, it's pretty sweet. There was the flip-flop on the F-35s, the gun grab that, despite assurances to the country, does target farmers and hunters. He lowered the Canadian flag for 6 months, I think, in reaction to the discovery of unmarked graves. At the beginning, frequently and slanderously, perhaps I've been going too long, slanderously referred to as mass graves, which wasn't a discovery at all. They were not discovered even, they were located. The original people in the area knew there was a graveyard in that area. It gets to be a bit much when the virtue signals out to protect Aboriginal people ignore Aboriginal knowledge. Here's what Trudeau had to say about it. I think Canadians have seen with horror those unmarked graves across the country and realized that what happened decades ago isn't part of our history, which perfectly illustrated the principle that he who controls the present controls the past, and he who controls the past controls the future, which is precisely the principles that wokies pursue, provided a one-sided, nuanced view of a horrific past, cancel anyone with a more nuanced view, and you can milk the guilt forever, and that is precisely what they intend to do. In their view, reconciliation will take generations and cost untold billions. So they think it's going to take generations. Are they not looking at the demographic change? So white people are not having enough kids, quite old. We're being replaced. Just literally. Whether it's a specific intention of anybody, I don't know whether that's the fact, but we're dying out. The people that they think whose ancestors are guilty of this are dying out. So do you think, how long do you think that people from India, that's where a lot are coming from, and Africa, Central America, are going to go along with this and be interested in this? I mean, it's a little bit like the socialist government. Eventually you run out of other people's money to spend, right? And in this case, you know, eventually you're going to run out of white guys to blame. Then what are you going to do? The thing that's especially galling to me about that situation is that I see so many Aboriginal people that are not benefiting from the largesse, are they? And that the people who are benefiting kind of look white, don't they? It's another, they're being colonized again, but this time by cultural Marxism. I would rather that Aboriginal people did well. I really would. Meanwhile, let's recall Trudeau's response of thank you for the donation in response to the Aboriginal protester who confronted him at Liberal fundraiser about mercury poisoning at Grassy Meadows First Nation. It cost $1,500 to attend that event, and as she was being kicked out, he repeated that comment a number of times. Thank you for the donation. And what's interesting about it too is the herd mentality or gang mentality. I forget exactly the right word. Mob mentality. So he's insulting this Aboriginal woman who had a legitimate complaint. And when he was sarcastic and cruel towards her, the Liberals in attendance applauded. Great. Kick her out. That happened. And it was cruel, as was his insistence that Patrick Brazeau cut off his hair in the event that he lost the charity boxing match in 2012. Reason? He knew that in his Aboriginal culture, losing your hair was humiliating. He wanted to shame him. This is what he said at the time. I wanted someone who would be a good foil, and we stumbled upon the scrappy tough guy senator from an indigenous community. He fit the bill, and it was a very nice counterpoint, Trudeau told Rolling Stone. I saw it as the right kind of narrative, the right story to tell. Okay, I mean, this is another one of those moments when you get dizzy. He thought that beating up and shaming an Aboriginal guy was considerably shorter than him was the right story to tell in the current environment. Let's face it, just to put it as nicely as possible, the man is dangerously divorced from reality. $54 million on the glitchy ArriveCan app that could have been done better and at a fraction of the cost, and it resulted in a massive hit to the tourism sector as it dissuaded tourists from visiting Canada. That was a major hit to the tourism sector. At no time during his time in office was the auditor, it's a new thing, at no time during his office was the Auditor General given the resources necessary to oversee government spending, especially during the pandemic. So all the spending that he's been involved in this whole time, the Auditor General has not been provided with the resources to track how he's spending the money. I mean, this is adding up, isn't it? When members of Parliament were putting together a rescue package for COVID, he tried to sneak in a passage allowing him complete control over the government's spending. Right? He wanted complete control. That's what a dictator, an authoritarian would want. Okay, at the end of the disastrously organized missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls inquiry that Aboriginal people said only served to re-traumatize them, which that's what you would expect it to do. So after that fiasco, he admitted erroneously that Canada was engaged in an ongoing genocide against Aboriginal people. If that is the case, why was he not put in front of the International Criminal court. Genocide is a crime. He admitted to it. My guess? The court looked at the billions upon billions of court settlements in the name of reconciliation, the adoption of UNDRIP, which even Jody Wilson-Raybould once said was unsustainable, the land acknowledgements, etc., and concluded that our Prime Minister, I'm sorry, is a coward and a nitwit. You're going to admit to an ongoing genocide in Canada in 2020 or 2021 or whenever that was? Are you serious? In 2021, 30 churches were burned down by what should be called ideologically motivated violent terrorists, but rarely are. How many times were these people or these events referred to in the Canadian Intelligence Report for 2021? Zero. The 2021 report that's supposed to keep track of violent extremists has made zero mention of the fact that these sometimes beautiful and very frequently important to the Aboriginal people themselves, 30 were burnt down. I don't know how many were vandalized, and the security report didn't mention it once for 2021. Look it up. Along with every branch of the government, CSIS has apparently been captured by the woke brigade, at least for the time being. Do you remember newspapers reporting on people claiming that the mass graves have been found outside former residential schools? They knew that was nonsense and reported it anyway. Mass grave, the implication is that you dumped a bunch of bodies in there after murdering them all at once, right? That's how it would be interpreted by most people. Just automatic mass graves. Okay, you killed a bunch of people, put them all in a big hole. Never happened. Not even close. That was slander against Canada, and it was spread around the world. So far, no more than 1 or 2 remains have actually been located, if that, which is surprising given that the residential schools did have graveyards and were opened in the late 19th century prior to development of many of the medical advances that saved the lives of so many people. I mean, it's as if people think, nobody died in the past. Smallpox, Spanish flu, that Great Depression, World War I, World War II. Those were very difficult times. People died a lot earlier than they do, and yet no remains to speak out have been exhumed. Something's fishy here. Under the Trudeau-appointed Defense Minister, Anita Anand, our military, which has adopted principles such as CRT. And what is CRT? Critical race theory? It has been a lot of things in theory. In practice, it is intended to cement the woke grievance industry into the foundations of our society, to encourage resentment and entitlement, and pursue even more affirmative action programs. In that universe, nothing will ever be enough. And that's absolutely true, because you can't convince someone to drop a bias that supports them financially. It's just very difficult to do. If I was one of the people, or if you were one of the people collecting money on this, you might have a niggling sense in the back of your mind, but because money is related to survival, so you're going to hang on to a bias that benefits you. And a lot of people are benefiting from the biases that woke culture generates. I think I may have already done this, but he trusted the people's liberation with our vaccine supply, and they totally burned us, slowing vaccine delivery when it was needed most. That led to a lot of suffering and death, but that is going to be nothing compared to the damage that the upcoming recession will cause. Poverty causes suffering and death. My, how the idiocies pile up. First, we were allowing flights arriving from China carrying a virus that was most likely created in a Chinese lab and against the advice of the democratic people of Taiwan, and at a time when China was limiting domestic flights. It's almost like they were trying to spread it, and early on, when there was no natural immunity and no vaccine, before it evolved into the less deadly form that it is now. Just think it through. Then we entrust the People's Liberation Army with our vaccine supply. Taking together, how much suffering and death does this series of screw-ups cause? Likely quite a lot. Meanwhile, inflation is through the roof. That causes poverty, and poverty causes suffering and death, and so does dysfunction in the medical system, which in some parts of the country is at least exacerbated by, did I get the pronunciation of that right? A lack of qualified health professionals who were removed from the workforce. You take thousands of qualified people out of the system and you suffer, don't you? Immigration, both legal and illegal, are way up. He has given out thousands of federal unionized jobs to people who won't have anything meaningful or anything useful to do. A lot will be involved with social justice initiatives that preach resentment and entitlement. Not like that would be divisive or anything. Why not go on dumping on the most open and generous country on earth? Per capita, we've been bringing in more immigrants than any country on earth, and it's been for quite a while. And I caught myself, I said that. I was going to say that we've been allowing more immigrants. And then I thought to myself, this is how it infiltrates your brain. And I thought, oh, maybe I shouldn't say allowed. Maybe I don't have the right to say we allowed immigration. Who am I? Who am I to say? There's some question about allowing them. Of course they can just come. That was in my own thought process. We have been bringing in more immigrants per year, and we show every intention of continuing to do so. So rather than saying allowing, I changed it to bringing in. We've been bringing in rather than allowing, because I doubted, who am I to say, who could be allowed? I'm just a Canadian citizen. Respond to a protest against your tyranny with your most tyrannical act yet. Shut down a peaceful protest, antagonize and persecute your political opponents looking for a violent response. The reason he was so rude to the truckers is because he wanted them to behave badly so that he could have the pleasure of stomping down on them. His base could have the pleasure of seeing them beat up or whatever would be involved. They wanted that thrill. And he thought that it would win him votes. He took almost no action against radical indigenous protesters who closed the rail system down to protest a resource project that most Aboriginal people wanted for the opportunity and tax revenue. Let's say this again. Canada should have been producing as much oil and gas as possible these last few years and spent much of the tax revenue on improving our own sustainability with more subways, more monies available for home insulation, more for alternative energy research and development. What it amounts to is that we tried to influence global emissions, which is impossible, while doing very little to curb our own, which was possible. As of June 22, 2022, inflation on food is running at 10%, according to the first thing that pops up if you key in what is the inflation rate in Canada. Feels like more than that. This is not a good thing going into what could be a stagflationary period with the Prime Minister dead set on increasing resentment and entitlement among people of color who are otherwise quite happy in Canada. Okay, so I live in a very racially diverse neighborhood, and on the street, nobody talks about this stuff. It's just not a thing. It takes time for people to get used to each other. That's a long, slow process, and in my opinion, except for the thugs and the junkies and all that, they might not even be that bad. People are really making an effort to get along. Canadians are making an effort to accommodate the people that are coming in. And just to be straight, if my government brings in people, too many people, puts a strain on the medical system, puts a strain on people who can't afford housing, I still believe that it is my personal responsibility to be as welcoming and friendly as possible, because why not? If you were coming from countries that were that poor, would you not take this opportunity? I don't blame them. I enjoy them. I would not want to live in a place that was not diverse. I just wouldn't. And by diverse, what I mean is I want like all kinds of people. I don't think that I would want to live in a place that was all Hindu or black or Chinese or Latin American. Not for too long. I don't think so. Because living as a minority is very uncomfortable. I did it for 20 years. 25 more like. Yeah, but I love multiculturalism. I'm sorry. I love multicultural environments. Multiculturalism is the idea that every culture is essentially equal to others. No. The cultures that are democratic are superior to the ones that aren't. Okay, so I'm just looking through here. So in some sense, what this one is about is trying to explain to people why people are so angry. So many people are so angry about what's going on. So you probably heard this. This is from the CBC. People, it's inevitable, a beige horizon. Brown meets white, no use in disguising. I think this is called Beige Horizon, this song that they put out. People out making whoopee, color blinded by love. Genetic crisscrossing, forget to wear a glove. Whoops, there it goes, generational drip. Look at the purebreds losing their grip. Listen up, all white supreme Nazi. Embrace the beige. Mixy mixy today. Put your hate away. How many? Again, I'm dizzy. I don't know. I mean, the CBC is putting out a thing that's saying, okay, yeah, if you're a racist, you don't have any little bit of racism in your body at all, then this is really going to hurt you, isn't it? Because people are out making love, they're out making friends. And it doesn't make any mention of how that might impact some people who would rather preserve the racial purity of their own people. Like, do you honestly think that there aren't Chinese people, say, for example, that are a little bit concerned that their race is being diluted? I know that's really the wrong kind of language, but it is how people feel. Some people feel that way. And there's going to be Chinese people and black people and Latin American people who are not all that fussy about seeing black or whatever mixing with anybody else. And it would go in every different direction. It would be between blacks and Chinese would have that feeling. Chinese and Latin Americans would probably have that feeling. Chinese and Indians would definitely feel weird about that. And you can tell by how seldom they mix. Right? You don't see that many black people getting together with Indians or whatever. There's that tendency in people to want to preserve that. It exists in every race. It exists in every culture. But here they have to pretend that it's only amongst us. Listen up, all white supreme Nazi. Embrace the beige. Mixy mixy today. Put your hate away. How many? So the Nazi thing reminded me of something that Justin Trudeau did in the House of Commons, and that was that he said that the Conservative Party was supporting Nazis when they said that in some ways they supported the truckers. They didn't support the horn honking. They didn't support the borders. Nobody with a brain in their head thought that was a good idea. But that's what they said. Trudeau said that. Trudeau called them Nazis, okay? And so as a point of fact, a lesbian Jewish woman stands up and asks for an apology. She said, my family died in the Holocaust. And now you're sitting across the chamber in the House of Commons in Canada calling me a Nazi. And he called another person a Nazi as well who was Jewish. And they stood up and asked him for an apology, and he refused to give it. Just imagine this. He called them Nazis for showing some support for some of the things that the truckers did. Called them Nazis. The woman stands up, says, "I'm a Jewish person whose family died in the Holocaust. Will you provide an apology?" And he wouldn't do it. I mean, it's beyond belief. Beyond belief, the things that this guy does. And there is a chance he'll be elected again. So here's one of the things he said. Pierre Poilievre, is playing and preying on the kind of anger and anxieties about some kind of Canada that used to be where men were men and white men ruled. Okay. Pierre Poilievre is playing on the anxieties of people who are longing for a time where men were men and white men ruled. Okay, Pierre Poilievre is married to a Brazilian woman. His mother was a single teenager. He was adopted by a man and a woman who were teachers. And his father, who he says he loves, is living with another man. So, and the thing is that with Pierre Poilievre, I've seen him with all kinds of different people. Pierre Poilievre is not a racist. Justin Trudeau is a racist. You can tell Justin Trudeau doesn't like Aboriginal people. That's the thing that's really galling to me. When he was first elected, he had an opportunity to do something really big about the boil water advisories right at the beginning. He didn't do it. Justin Trudeau does not like Aboriginal people. He looks down on them. Okay, I'm just going to say, yeah, his agenda is to divide and conquer. It's the oldest trick in the book, but in this case, its application is totally bizarre. Per capita, Canada is the most welcoming country in the world. European Canadians are literally being replaced, a fact that is both celebrated and denied. So you could look up the Great Replacement Theory or whatever, and they'll say, "Oh, it's no poo-poo-poo," of course, that's just so ridiculous. Look how dumb they are, right? But then what you got is something like the Beige Horizon thing, where it's celebrated. All the diversity programs celebrate it. Europeans are literally being replaced, or, we're not reproducing ourselves. I mean, doing it to ourselves at the same time. A fact that is both celebrated and denied. It's as though no amount of immigration is too much. Meanwhile, all Canadians are dealing with, just for example, the frustration of almost never talking to a native speaker of English when they make calls to businesses and government on the telephone. And I live in probably one of the most diverse parts of Canada. I love it, but the fact that I go and quite often in government offices and meet someone who doesn't speak English very well is a constant strain. I think that for native speakers, you develop a skill with that pretty rapidly, if you're doing it all the time. Okay, so this situation of making a phone call and never getting a native speaker of English is bad enough when a native speaker makes a call, but when a non-native speaker makes a call only to be greeted by another non-native speaker of another language, it can become almost impossible to communicate. And I observe this all the time. So there's a sort of an annoyance there, isn't there? And there's perhaps even a question about safety and all that kind of thing. It becomes difficult to communicate with other people. That's a problem. I think that everyone acknowledges that immigration into Canada is inevitable, it's necessary, and there's some of us that think that it's wonderful. But the problem is that you're prevented from even talking about it. The first time I heard anybody talk about this is me. Sorry. It's just the first time I've heard it. I imagine people talk about it all over the place, but I don't talk to them. What I'm saying is that it doesn't show up in media. Just this fundamental issue. If it was a smaller number of people per year, then it would be easier to And now I'm careful about what word to absorb them, to integrate them. Is that the correct way to say it? Is that, should I do that? Will I get in trouble because I didn't phrase that exactly? The self-censorship goes on even in people who are opposed to it as much as I am. The censorship, I mean. It's still like a background program that's running in my head all the time. Even though what I'm talking about is a problem that affects immigrants even more than me, right? So let's say, who complains? Nobody, because they're afraid. That's the thing. They're afraid of backlash from the cancel culture crowd. If people are afraid of expressing legitimate concerns, they are being tyrannized. I've heard from doctors that due to COVID mandates in hospitals, foreign doctors and nurses are taking over from people who rejected the vaccine and were fired or laid off. The result? Communication in hospitals is a problem. Is that one of the reasons they're functioning so poorly? Probably it's got something to do with it. That racist Pierre Poilievre, by the way, is gung-ho on immigration despite these difficulties. Here, I go through it again. He's married to a Brazilian woman, and his stepfather, who he professes to love, now lives with another man. Some redneck he turned out to be. He may win the next election by appealing to the conservative values of many immigrants who look at problems like the sudden increase in late onset gender dysphoria in horror. A social contagion facilitated by schools and social media is resulting in young women losing their breasts and fertility. Irreversible damage by Abigail Schreier, her interview with Jordan Peterson happens to be a very good one, would be a good place to start if you want to learn more about it. Remember a badass defense minister, Harjit Sajjan? The guy the Liberals all drooled over? He cancelled an inquiry into Canada's role in the transfer of detainees to Taliban fighters to Afghan authorities, who went on to torture them in the most horrendous ways. He cancelled that inquiry. Reason? But we do not know, but many suspect that it was him because he was involved in it himself. He was involved in putting prisoners into a position where they would be tortured, and he was also in a position to cancel the inquiry into whether or not that happened. The case went to the ethics commissioner, who concluded, bizarrely, there was no conflict of interest in him squashing an inquiry that could have very likely impacted himself. In case you don't believe me, I'll just do the whole thing. Last Wednesday, June 7th, Defense Minister Harjit Sajjan released a new Canadian defense policy telling Canadians we have much to offer the cause of global peace, stability, and prosperity, which is the kind of anodyne comment that they're always coming up with. So from this article, his remarks came 1 year to the day after a letter signed by Joe Clark, Elizabeth May, Ed Broadbent, Ron Atke, and dozens of others called for a public inquiry into Canadians' handling of the transfer of Afghan detainees during its decade-long military mission in Afghanistan. So this was an issue. By exposing hundreds of Afghans to such high risks of torture, Canada failed utterly to prevent the torture of many of them, thus floating one of the most basic legal and moral obligations, the prohibition of torture enshrined in customary international law, the letter said. This is unfinished business of the most serious kind. Last year, Sajjan said an inquiry was not needed in the case, but the issue, which has dogged the Canadian government, first under Stephen Harper and most recently under Justin Trudeau for years, may resurface sooner than expected. That's a quote from Open Canada. I'm just getting tired here, so that's it. Thank you for your patience.